that,
So as I can
and then that's the record button.
Okay, the red button.
Yeah, and it'll tell you in there that it's recording.
Mm-hmm.
You push it again.
Intermission to reconnect. So it's my pleasure to welcome Gregg Mann from Columbia University to speak with us here today at Duke. Gregg is somebody that I've known for a long time. The first time I was headed to Mali to do pre-dissertation research, I had no idea what I was doing, where I should go, where I had to go to get research authorization and these kinds of things. And somehow somebody gave me Gregg's email, who was in Mali at the time, and he gave me these elaborate directions as to where I would go to get this stamp that I would need to then go to this office, and then that I would have to go here to get this affiliation before I could go and eventually get the research authorization. And I read this and I thought, he was directing me to go to the corner where they sell plastic buckets, and then turn right on the first right, and then go down until they're selling kebabs. And I thought, well, this is not very precise. But when I went there, I followed these directions.
In Africa.
When I got there, I followed these directions very closely, and it turned out they were spot on. I did get my research authorization. I did find the obvious place where they sell plastic buckets. And I have since used that in all directions I give to others going to Mali or Bamako. So Gregg has does his research, or has done most of his research in Mali. He finished his PhD at Northwestern University in the year 2000, and in 2006 he published his first book, which was called Native Sons, West African Veterans in France in the 20th Century. It was published with Duke University Press, and it was the winner of at least one prize for best book, I think, in French history in 2006. And Gregg is currently working on, he's the author of an awful lot of really interesting work. He's one of the people, I think, that does best this, that works both in a very local West African context. His work is very much based in a series of local West African contexts. His training is at least, I think, primarily that of an Africanist, sensitive to the vernacular, if I might say so, of different parts of West Africa. But he's also interested in the larger space of French Empire. And so I think almost better than anybody else, Gregg is able to move between the local and the larger imperial French Empire. And the thing that he has agreed to talk to us today about is a book that he has that will be coming out shortly. Provisional title is The End of the Road, Non-Governmentality in the West African Sahel. And this promises to be a very exciting look, again, at this sort of larger space between the southern edge of the Sahara Desert and across a variety of political spaces. So I hope you'll welcome me and you'll join me in welcoming Gregg to Duke, and we hope that we'll have this AV thing set up in a second.
I'm sure that applause is for the eloquent introduction. Thank you for inviting me, Bruce. And I apologize to everyone for the delay getting the presentation started. I have a few maps that I thought might be useful, because when I began working on this project, I needed a lot of maps, and I thought it would be reasonable to provide you with them as well. But maybe they'll be available, maybe they won't. And I want to just thank Bruce also not only for inviting me, but also for sharing documents with me that actually form part of the evidence for this paper. And a few of the images that I have were actually given to me by another colleague, Baz McCock, and it's one of the good things about working in African history is there's something collaborative about the venture. Okay. So the title of the talk is Imperial Shadows and French West African Muslims in Sudan. And it takes off from an observation in a classic essay on migration by Abdulmalik Sayad, who argued that the way one thinks about immigration is a product of state thought, and that thinking, this is a quote, thinking about immigration means thinking about the state for the state is thinking about itself when it thinks about immigration. He goes on, it is in the very nature of the state to discriminate between the nationals it recognizes as such and in which it recognizes itself, and others with whom it deals only in material or instrumental terms. Now this is kind of a schematic way of thinking about the importance of recognition in state thought. Saad was a sociologist and not a historian, and empire was the precondition but not the subject of his studies of Algerian migration to France. But taking off from his insight, in this paper I want to examine the recomposition of forms of political identity in turbulent times, such as at the dissolution of empires and the establishment of African independence. And this paper really focuses on first a broad time period and then a very narrow time period from 56 to 61. And in it I try to understand the state as an unfinished project, an entity coming into being, and to profit from what Saad termed immigration's secret virtue. Not as he intended to pursue a sociology of the state, but to stage a confrontation between a particular form of historicity and a particular form of post-colonial governmentality. But let me, now I'll start my timer, which means that first 5 minutes was free. Let me experiment first in thinking like a state. In 2001, the government of Mali reported that a mere 3.7% of that country's migrants were in Europe, in spite of the fact that it was these migrants who garnered by far the most attention from journalists, governments, NGOs, and academics. On the contrary, 91% of Mali's migrants were elsewhere in Africa, where their presence drew much less attention. It's important that the census 2001, this is before the conflict in Côte d'Ivoire and before the Darfur conflict. Mali at the time counted as many Malians in Sudan as it estimated lived in France. This is counterintuitive if you've studied Mali migration or had a sense of Mali migration. It's not what one would expect. And the juxtaposition of migration to these two states is an unusual one. France and Sudan are rarely thought about in the same frame. Not only because of the sharp divide that exists between those who study immigration to the rich countries of the world and those who study South-South migrations. But pairing these two migrations requires moving along two distinct axes. One of them is west-east across the Sahel being that strip of arable land just south of the Sahara Desert. The other axis being south-north, from Mali, Mauritania, Senegal, essentially, to France in particular. One chapter of the book I'm working on looks at that south-north axis, and this paper is drawn from the chapter that looks at the west-east axis. Now, pairing them, those two axes, also requires shifting from a region not defined by a state, the Sahel, to an imperial frame, and moving between an analysis, which I hope to offer today, grounded in the long-term historical trends of a region that prizes the depth and resonance of a particular past, partly for its own sake, to a truncated history, on the other hand, a truncated history of European empires, their dissolution, and the rise of new post-colonial states. So I'm trying to look at the contraction of empire, rather than its rise, as a point of entry into the history of Sahelian migrations. And what I hope to illustrate is the fluidity of terms of political membership at work in the Sahel in precise moments, such as at decolonization. But to do that with an awareness of long-running historical trends and historical developments that preceded and survived modern empires. So this is sort of the gambit. It's a little bit large. I hope you'll forgive me. For the Sahel, the late 50s and 60s represented not only a period of decolonization, state formation, and imperial collapse, but also a crisis of individual and collective political memberships. And this period saw the most vigorous pursuit of state formation in the 20th century in much of the Sahel. In the wake of expansive and ill-defined notions of citizenship and nationality developed under the French Fourth and Fifth Republics, and in the aftermath of Sudanese independence, migrants found themselves squeezed by new states' dual imperatives of creating compatriots or citizens and creating foreigners. The project of making colonial subjects into imperial citizens had been a strategy of imperial France in its decades of decline. The independent states, by which I mean both the formal imperial power of France and the new post-colonial states, Senegal, Mali, Niger, Sudan, Chad, Nigeria, sought to create foreigners, those states sought to create foreigners as well as citizens. They wanted to include as well as to exclude. So for West Africans in the Sudan in the late 50s and early 60s, and for those in France a little later, passports and travel documents became tools of aggressive inclusion and exclusion. So I'm focusing really on passports and travel documents and how they're used to define different forms of political identity in moments of flux. Let me jump forward a little bit to thinking about the first part of a three-part kind of comparison I'm going to make. And this is the part that is focused really on kind of historicity of pilgrims, foreigners, and imperial shadows. The West African presence in Sudan is old, deep, and dynamic, and the west-east Sahelian axis long predates the presence of European empires. But if those empires didn't generate that axis of migration, their presence was the precondition for its transformation. In 20th century, pilgrimage routes, the phenomenon of the pilgrimage itself, and colonial awareness of it concealed new forms of migration from the West. So in studying this period, there's actually a rich literature on pilgrims, which is actually a literature of migration. Yet from such a perspective, to think of these pilgrims as migrants, we have to adjust our vision in a couple of ways. By mid-century, pilgrims would be identified by nationality, but older forms of identification would remain at work. These migrants and pilgrims were not Malians, Nigerians, or Nigerians. They were Muslims, Takuri, or Falata in local languages. In the 19th century and earlier, merchants, pastoralists, and pilgrims to Mecca had constituted the west-east flow of migrants. And among the latter, this is a very important point, among the latter, the pilgrims, many took years or even decades to make the pilgrimage, and often settled for long periods of time, setting down permanent roots. So in this kind of context, in which the question of who got there first would often determine access to land, water, and grazing rights in these new pilgrim communities, it's no surprise there's a separate term for the pioneers of the eastward migration. That term, Mullah, would originally refer to those who had been born in the Sudan of foreign parents who were considered to have foreign ancestry. And the date of their arrival is not that important for our purposes, simply that they arrived before the time of the Mahdi in the late 19th century. Other Westerners who came later will represent separate and distinct waves. They include notably a veteran of Uthman Dan Fodio's early 19th century jihad that established the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria. That veteran would rally to the Mahdi's successor, whose grandfather himself appears to have been a Fulani. And these ties went in both directions. In the 19th century, sheikhs from Darfur and Kordofan actually frequented the courts of Sokoto's commercial entrepôts in northern Nigeria. So you find these Muslim scholars from Sudan in northern Nigeria, not there to teach Islam to the Nigerians, but in fact the inverse, to study Islam with the Nigerians. In fact, some of the, and this is your reading for next week. Right. So these ties run in both directions, and what I try to do in this part of the project is to think about Islamic scholarship and participation in particular Sufi orders, notably the Tijaniya, as kind of isotopes. If you trace these, you can see the migratory patterns. The intellectual history is more apparent than the deeper history of migration. Let me just pull these maps. I think it's probably helpful to have some sense of where I'm talking about. And they might not be beautiful, but hopefully they'll be reasonably functional. So this is roughly a not beautiful map of the Sahel. This is a map you're probably more familiar with of colonial Africa. This is circa 1913. My point is simply that all that is blue is French territory. That which is pink is British. Those of us who study the blue rarely study the pink, and vice versa, and sort of think about, okay, what does that line between the blue and the pink actually represent in terms of African historical patterns and sort of longue durée change and migration. This is another not beautiful map from a wonderful book by a Sudanese scholar on the pilgrimage tradition in West Africa. I'm using it here because it actually demonstrates, do you see the cursor? Anyway, you can see Sokoto. So I'm talking about people going effectively from Sokoto. Later on I'm talking about this region of Mali, but especially people from Hausaland, which is both part of Niger, but mostly part of Nigeria, so both British and French territory in the 20th century. Moving east, establishing themselves often in Wadai, Darfur, Kordofan, and then in what would become irrigation schemes at the confluence, south of the confluence of the Nile. And my point is simply that the process of the West and East were closely bound, that looking at Islamic scholarship and Sufi practices illustrates some of those ties. Notably, what would become the dominant Sufi order in Darfur, the Tijaniya, came to Sudan from West Africa and came from particular West African sheikhs, both from Senegal and via Nigeria onto Sudan. So this in spite of a complex and ambivalent stance that Sokoto leadership, the leadership of the 19th century caliphate, would take towards the Hajj. They were not in favor of the Hajj, and they were hostile towards the vibrant Mahadist ideas of the 20th century. The point is simply that the bond between Sudan's western provinces, Hausa land, and the western Sahel will remain multiple, braided, and Muslim. And these are some of the shadows, I consider these to be kind of shadows, both of the distant empire of Sokoto and also of the Tijaniya, which wasn't a political but a kind of a religious association. Colonial conquest in the late 19th century would first strengthen and later profoundly transform those ties to the West, and it would deepen those shadows, somewhat paradoxically. The fall of the Sokoto Caliphate to British and, more importantly, Christian invaders in 1903 spurred a wave of settlers to undertake a hijra to Darfur while it was still under Muslim rule. Over the next 2 decades, the consolidation of British rule in the Sudan, weak as it often was, would generate the infrastructure from rails to irrigation schemes that attracted or enabled future generations of migrants to settle still further east. If few pilgrims desired or could afford to take the train, many simply followed the rails on foot. And so you can see on this map of Sudan, the train doesn't reach Nyala until I think the 1950s, but upward it reaches in the early part of the 20th century, and from there you can simply follow the tracks and walk to the Red Sea. I mean, it's a long walk, but you can arrive at the Red Sea and continue your pilgrimage if that is your intention. So pilgrims settled along the rail lines that would eventually lead from Darfur to Kassala near the Ethiopian border and beyond. They also settled on the irrigated land of the Gezira project, which opened in 1924 and attracted a lot of people from the West with new, rich, fertile, and irrigated land. Right. So after the Second World War, as independently organized caravans began to make the overland Hajj by truck, struggling notably across colonial borders like this one between Zinder and Kano, so between Niger and Nigeria on their way to Sudan and further, the number of West Africans increased exponentially. Extrapolating from a late colonial census that is widely considered a benchmark in Sudan's demographic history, a geographer writing in the 1970s calculated the Sudan's West African population as well over 1 million. This was a major demographic transition. Given the importance of infrastructure, empire, and secular as well as spiritual temporalities to that transition, one could even call it modern. But non-European empires continued to cast their own shadows. In spite of the superficial homogeneity of the Westerners, they were all Muslims, many spoke Hausa or Pular, large majority had origins in northern Nigeria or Niger. Distinctions remained within that broad category, and the British government had accentuated these. For instance, in 1930, it created a new district, provisionally termed a Dar, in the Blue Nile province for Maiorno, who was the anti-Mahadist son of the Caliph of Sokoto, who had made the 1903 Hijra after his father's death. So they reproduced some of the political authority that was kind of a fragment of what existed in Sokoto in Sudan to rule over Hausa migrants in Sudan. Importantly, the Maiorno was given jurisdiction neither over migrants from Sokoto elsewhere in Sudan, nor over Westerners who were not from Sokoto who lived within his region or any other indigenous population. So one empire was adopting the traces of another to set the frame in which political power would be exercised. While the Mwawid may have been considered autochthons or locals, having been there for many generations, at least by the administration, Maiorno and his followers could be referred to by more general and imprecise terms Falata, or less commonly Takrur, and their different variants. So in the decades following the transition from slave to migrant labor in the early 20th century, Sudanese landholders apparently analyzed the changing times in a simple dictum widely quoted. Allah took away our slaves and sent us the Falata to work as migrants. Takrur resonated differently, although in a fashion that's harder to define, referring to the ancient kingdom along the Senegal River Valley, along the Fukatoro, Tugan and Ouagadougou. The term Takruri and its variants seems to have had several different senses in mid-century Sudan. According to one Malian pilgrim of the 1940s, in Mecca, if you've got enough to get by, in other words, if you've got money, the Arabs no longer call you Takrur, meaning black, but a black Arab. Such terms and their etymologies don't figure in the state logic that constructs a census, like the one Sudan undertook in 1955-56. Those terms were themselves historical artifacts from a past the new state of Sudan did not care to share or even to recognize. For Sudan on the threshold of independence, the Falata or Takruri were officially, quote, and were counted as Westerners of doubtful nationality, or as foreigners of West African origin, A, with Sudanese status, or B, with non-Sudanese status. Little mattered that for London and Paris, the Takrori were British subjects or French nationals. In Sudan's western provinces in particular, the colonial presence had been brief and starkly minimal. In spite of the fact that the shadows cast by the European empires deepened paradoxically in their twilight years, they did not obliterate those of the Mahdiya, the Sokoto Caliphate, or the Tijaniya. In fact, a serious look at the colonial period in western Sudan, and especially in Darfur, quickly reveals that it's hardly more than a thin seam between two tumultuous moments of imperial collapse, that of the Muslim empires of the 19th century and the European empires of the 20th. The colonial period in Darfur is 1916 to 1956. It's arguably the shortest period anywhere on the continent, barring obviously Ethiopia. At independence, that thin seam would literally be papered over, both in census categories to which historical links were irrelevant, and in the fitful extension of a regime of governmental rationality and the documents that went with it, over an internally dynamic and relatively longue durée process. So that's my section on historicity. Now I want to talk a little bit about the problem of papers and travel documents in the French Fifth Republic in Sudan. In the period of independence, adult pilgrims began to carry imperial passports with the names of children of the same sex as their bearer inscribed in them alongside an identity photo. As a house of pilgrim from Nigeria who made the voyage east circa 1960 told the Nigerian ethnographer Bawayamba, quote, "At the border between Abéché, Chad, and El Janina, Sudan, they examined our passports. They looked at the picture of Aisha, my deceased daughter, who shared a passport with her mother, my wife. The official looked at the photograph and asked, 'Where's Aisha?' I said, 'She died in Kassel, Chad.' And he put a cross on her photograph." Pilgrim passports were frequently scarred with what Bawayama calls little red crosses in ink on the faces of loved ones, lending support to his evocative observation that, quote, "The Sudanese villages of these pilgrims are in fact liminal stations strung between home and Mecca, along a route emotionally charged with the graves of the beloved ones they have lost on their way." Indeed, papers are often necessary even to be allowed to bury one's dead. And he has stories about people being unable to bury their dead for lack of proper documentation. What can these stories about pilgrims' passports and papers, evocative and imprecise as they are, tell us about organizing and securing modern definitions of categories like nation and nationality in a long moment of extreme political flux? In other words, that's the work that we think that papers do. It seems they do other things as well. What can these kind of stories tell us about governmentality, membership, and empire, and about entangled histories? For Isan Goiba, the Malian who had begun his own pilgrimage in 1944, it was not like it is now, when before leaving you have to first look for the right papers. Before, all you had to do was decide, get up and go. Only along the way would you run into difficulties due to the problem of papers. The problem of papers would arrive along the way, but would only become acute on the border between French Chad and British Sudan, or much more frequently on the Red Sea ports of Soweto, Massawa, or Port Sudan. On the coast, pilgrims needed not only to change their Sudanese pounds into Saudi currency, they had to obtain travel documents attesting to their political identity and verifying they could neither spread nor contract particular contagious diseases. Yet for European empires, attempting to establish the identities or political provenances of individual pilgrims had long been a headache they'd best avoided. So in both Sudan and Eritrea, where the Red Sea ports were, the solution had been found in a laissez-faire policy in which Italian, French, and British administrators took part for decades. Before 1956, all West Africans had passed for British subjects. The Nigerian Bureau claimed French West Africans as their own, and the Sudanese government provided travel papers. In short, a French administrator's analysis of Eritrea holds for the Sudan as well. Lumped in with natives of British West Africa, under the generic name Takrori, or Nigerian, or Sudanese, our people have benefited from an intentionally lax regime. Such a policy was very ill-suited to cope with two post-war phenomena period of independence. The fact from the late 1940s, many more Muslims began to undertake the pilgrimage across the Sahel, and the uneven emergence of new nation states from European empires. So the independence of Sudan in 1956 thoroughly challenged the laissez-faire status quo, as the new government, in keeping partly with Saudi demands, sought to create a more stringent system of immigration and border controls. The two states had similar motivations. One of them was public health. Darfur in particular had what one historian has called a terrifying history of public health, or its absence, in the 20th century. That of Saudi Arabia was not much better. The imperial governments had only begun to discuss establishing quarantines on the vast western Sudanese border of the province after a smallpox outbreak in 1951. But by independence, Sudan had a quarantine law, and they would run year-round quarantine camps. But public health concerns were only part of the problem. There's also a fear that states have of being saddled with the expense of repatriating impecunious pilgrims, which can be quite expensive things to do. So in short, the new state had begun to seek greater control over its territory. And this is an image of people entering into Saudi Arabia being required to pay the taxes and the entry fees from the 1940s. As early as 1955, Sudan had attempted to limit the entry of foreign Africans, and Khartoum had declared that it would no longer provide pilgrims with passports allowing them to cross the Red Sea and enter Saudi Arabia. And what this meant was that if Saudi Arabia made a new requirement, then Sudan had to respond. As Sudan responded, then Chad had to respond, and the requirements basically go from east to west as each state passes them on to the neighbor. The problem was that the new requirements demanded papers that had never been provided before. Few of the West Africans who come to Sudan before 56 had any papers at all. And Sudan's intransigence will only be compounded by the souring of relations in the context of the Suez Crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So the laissez-faire system was in distress. The French ambassador in Khartoum believed, and he feared, that the government of Sudan would easily give Sudanese nationality to the Westerners within its borders, both in order to secure a necessary and cheap labor force and to boost the total population of the country in order to have a better claim on the headwaters of the Nile and UN development funds. So from his perspective, that is the French ambassador in Khartoum, an entire category of people for whom he struggled to find an apt designation, French Africans, the French of Sudanic Africa, or our African compatriots, faced the threat of being abandoned by France and scooped up by Sudan. Worse, they might become stateless. The embassy could sit by and let this happen, but doing that would reflect badly on France's African vocation, as he called it, right in the middle of the Algerian War and decolonization across Africa. But the Sudanese law on nationality that eventually did take effect was the inverse of what the ambassador had expected. The law limited Sudanese nationality to those who were present in territory that became the Western Sudan since before conquest in 1898 of Darfur, and the first conquest, and to their descendants. A modification in the 70s would expand those terms, but still very constrictive idea of who could have Sudanese nationality. You had to be on the territory before 1924, before the opening of the Gezira scheme. This meant that Westerners would not be considered Sudanese by a new regime which was intent on the Arabization of the Sudan. So with this law, Sudan became one of the very few African countries formerly under British rule to privilege an approach to citizenship based on ancestry, missing an opportunity to consolidate an expansive opportunity by incorporating all of those present on it, or favoring place of birth as the determining factor. But the new lines are not marked only in soil or blood. A policy of Arabization could be seen in language requirements as well. So, a definition of Sudanese ordinance from 1948 that was refined by the 1957 independent government required that one had adequate knowledge of Arabic or another language in common use in Sudan. But the 1957 law mentioned only Arabic and excluded other African languages. Those who didn't have knowledge of Arabic would have to prove they had been resident in Sudan for more than 20 years before becoming eligible for Sudanese nationality. This mattered partly because to exercise any occupation other than small-scale cash crop production, this is quote, or unskilled manual laboring, one had to have a trade license, and to have a trade license, one had to have nationality. After 1960, Nigeria, which was the place of origin of many Westerners, had a similar set of requirements. Those in the Sudan who sought Nigerian citizenship were required both to speak Hausa, which some had lost in favor of Arabic, and to know the names of village chiefs from their home districts in Nigeria, which they might have left decades earlier, so therefore making this an impossible task. The requirements seemed designed to make it impossible for pilgrims to pass the test. As a result of these complementary restrictive nationality laws, many Hausa and other West Africans in Sudan would remain effectively stateless and unable to conduct business legally. So in theory, they would be disenfranchised, and in practice, they would be vulnerable and dependent. In contrast with the exclusionary Sudanese and Nigerian approaches, the French state actively sought to claim pilgrims and migrants as French nationals. Its diplomats in Sudan hoped to maintain France's position as an African power, and to realize, in however partial a manner, the promise of a new citizenship in one of the constituent republics of the French community. And now I'm talking about a narrow window of time between 1958 and 1960. That citizenship was ill-defined but generally porous and inclusive. There was no expectation that a French national would speak or understand French, and still less that he or she would have the papers to prove his or her nationality. This was an expansive and simulating imperial citizenship, one elaborated for a future that did not come to pass. Be that as it may, by 58, the stakes would be higher than the ambassador's phrase, "our African vocation," had suggested. Questions of passports, diplomatic representation, and organization of pilgrimage were crucial to the notion of the French community in Africa, because along with defense and control of a currency, diplomatic representation figured among the three thoroughly centralized functions that the community maintained in the Constitution of 1958. Others had all been devolved onto the territories, now dubbed republics, which were former colonies. So it's a little bit of a complex, yeah, that's a different story, but probably related. Sudan. In Sudan, the French embassy would struggle to establish the relevance of its diplomatic protection to French Africans expelled from Egypt in '59 and Saudi Arabia in 1960. Sudan didn't want to admit them and sent some directly on to Chad without reference to the French embassy. And this begged the question, if other nations did not recognize French claims on African pilgrims, then what were those claims worth? And if the community, an embattled community, was not a collectivity grounded in a shared political identity, what was it? So in 1958, just after the Sudanese law was elaborated, the French Foreign Ministry assigned the task of surveying French nationals in Sudan to René Gross, an administrator with experience in Chad, knowledge of Arabic, interest in labor migration. So Gross goes to Khartoum, he meets the different Chadian collectivities, tells them he wants to run a census, and soon his offices are flooded with people coming to register themselves. As he says, it is remarkable that all those counted have been in Sudan for more than 5 years, and some for 15 years or more. This proves that those from French Africa don't intend to abandon their original nationality, by which he means French nationality. If a few of them have accepted the Sudanese identity card, it's pure opportunism, and without feeling at all obligated or tied by that card. Now, whether or not these Westerners recognized themselves in the state that recognized them, Gross quickly found many more French Africans in Khartoum than he had expected. They figured there might be 100,000 to 200,000, soon realized there were well more than 300,000. They counted more than 10,000 French Africans in one district of Khartoum alone. And in the census, they recognized many Chadians, house merchants from Niger, and citizens of the Muslim majority republics within the community, within the French. Mauritania, Senegal, what would become Mali, and the Central Africans. Thanks to Gross, wrote the administrator, the Hausa from French Niger in particular, who by tradition were under the protection of the Sudanese and the British, amongst whom they originally passed themselves off as being from Nigeria, increasingly tend to demand our protection and their registration of our consulate. So it's the pilgrims themselves who are pushing to acquire French papers and the recognition of French nationality. What's happening is in the liminal years at the end of British rule in Sudan, at the beginning of a short, sharp transition within the French Empire in the Sahel, there are overlapping imperial shadows of Britain, Sokoto, waxing and waning, and the new nation states begin to throw their own shadows. And that shadow, or those shadows, the history of them, is even more somber and more brutal than the shadow metaphor would suggest, and this is the third part of the paper, on pilgrims, slaves, and passports. So let me think like another state, just for a moment. I hope I'm not moving too fast. I know that I'm jumping around in space. But I want to go to the Republic of Mali. The Republic of Mali's interest in West African pilgrims was intense, even passionate. Mali became independent in 1960. It had its passionate concern, both because of its deep concern in the early years of its existence that the pilgrimage served as both a screen for the development of resistance movement among Saharans and Sahelians opposed to being ruled from Bamako, and that it served as a cover for the pawning or selling of household slaves and vulnerable travelers in Saudi Arabia and neighboring states. So from this perspective of the Republic of Mali, the extension of French travel documents, or laissez-passer, to Malian pilgrims was deeply troubling, as it facilitated the movement of Tuareg leaders or Saharans performing their own hijra away from Malian rule, bringing with them Bella, or people of slave descent, particularly women and children. This is a story that Bruce knows, in fact, better than I do. I'm exploiting it here ruthlessly. Thus, as eagerly as French diplomats had sought to reclaim their nationals in Sudan in the late 1950s, Mali in the early 60s fought to stake its own claim. Within a year of independence, the gloves would come off entirely. In a letter to the Saudian Director of Security, the Malian Commissioner for the Pilgrimage, Abdul Wahab Doucouré, would insist that travel papers offered by the French were illegal, and that Paris's embassy in Khartoum had no mandate to deliver laissez-passer to Malian nationals. By doing so, it was simply encouraging what he called the traffic in slaves. There's a context for this, which is a slavery controversy from the 1950s affecting Mali, then under colonial rule, and Saudi Arabia. There's also the context of a gestating rebellion that would break out openly in the Sahara in 1963. So So it's a dynamic situation I won't go into details of, but the concerns about slavery weren't entirely new. In 54 and 55, the West African Commissioner for the Pilgrimage, the Senegalese Muslim chef de bataillon, Amadou Fall, had argued that passports could help fight trafficking, which he was sure was taking place, and that draconian conditions should be imposed for obtaining them. This is at the same time the French government is trying to give them away. It would help, he thought, if the French government could better identify who was leaving its territory, i.e. crossing the Chad-Sudan border, and who sought its travel papers to cross the Red Sea. If it could do that, it could stop the clandestine export of women and children in particular. And as you can see from this image, even very small children were making the pilgrimage. This is an older man from Gao, and the youngest pilgrim on that particular convoy from the 1940s. So this idea that there was a clandestine export of women and children, and that travel papers could help restrain that, might explain why, a few years later, when young Aisha died on her voyage east through Chad, a border guard crossed out her portrait on her mother's passport. It also helps explain why Ducré accused Paris of abetting the slave trade by too readily delivering passports. On an airstrip in Jeddah in 1961, Ducré would encounter a Malian exile, accompanied by 29 women and a couple of men, all of whom he had good reason to believe had been brought from Mali for sale in Hijaz. All had their travel papers from the French embassy in Khartoum. This was the incident that upset him so much.
What year was that? I'm sorry.
That was 61.
Wow.
Now, the result of this is that in the government of Mali and its Minister of the Interior, Madira Keita, in 1961, went on a vast campaign to try to stop people from making the pilgrimage, or to warn them that countries like Nigeria and Sudan that sold passports to pilgrims were motivated solely by greed, and that they would be very vulnerable as pilgrims to some form of trafficking in Saudi Arabia. Warned also that the same greed that characterized Nigerian and Sudanese sellers of passports would make these people vulnerable. Okay, I'm repeating myself here, excuse me. So in response to Keita's circular warning administrators about this, there was a big campaign with religious leaders and administrators calling together former pilgrims, potential pilgrims, and others, practicing Muslims, to encourage people not to go. So in an unanticipated irony of independence, the ostensibly virtuous enterprise of the pilgrimage was clandestine before the same label was attached to Malian migration to France. That didn't happen in the 1970s. The joint effort of Ducré and Keita to claim pilgrims, migrants, and Bella as Malians represented an important attempt to extend a new regime of governmental rationality, inflicted with the ideology of independence and anti-colonialism, along an ancient but dynamic axis. They and their colleagues understood very well that even more than control over borders, travel papers and control over movement represented sovereignty, which especially, as I've said, in the context of the French community, was very much up for definition. Including us, let me go back to Abdel-Malik Sayad and his theme of recognition. In vulnerable pilgrims and migrants, leading figures in Mali's government recognized themselves in terms that were more than instrumental. They were deeply effective. Hints of this passion had already appeared in the final report on the Hajj written by Commissioner Fall from the 1950s, and they would recur in the Malian government's extensive responses to a 1966 UN survey on slavery. As for Modibo Keita, Mali's president, and Madira Keita, the Minister of the Interior, they seem to have recognized themselves in the language of a leading Saharan dissident who refused to be governed, as he put it, by nègres. For them, Negroes would probably be the best translation. For them, that is Modibo and Madira Keita, they in turn, the leading Saharan dissidents were in turn nègres, or slave traders, and the lines between them were clear. This is the situation that will eventually result in civil war. When 120 Malian slaves sought refuge, or what the Malian government considered as slaves, sought refuge in the country's new embassies in Jeddah and Cairo in 1962, the arrest of those who tried to sell them brought a grim satisfaction back in Bamako. But the year after this incident, and the year after its own abolition, Saudi Arabia would refuse to recognize travel documents issued to African pilgrims by the French government. It would appear that the new African states could claim to have won this minor skirmish in the battle to establish their sovereignty. Not only papers matter, but it mattered that slaves or potential slaves were citizens. It mattered to which state they belonged and how that belonging was recognized. But the issue of trafficking offers only one answer to the question of how and why it mattered as much as it did. Another lies in acknowledging the more mundane aspects of managing the pilgrimage itself as important elements of statecraft, not only for Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and the other Sahelian states, but also for a post-imperial France increasingly invested in informal and symbolic means of expressing its power, and anxious, in fact, to continue to have French delegations at the pilgrimage. Such an acknowledgement leaves open the question of whether or not, in Sayyad's terms, France recognized itself in formerly French West African pilgrims, and how and why it ceased to do so. To the best of their power, Mali and Sudan refused to allow it to do so. These states were not neo-colonial. That might have happened later. But much the same battle between newly independent states over the objects and subjects of government would play out very differently in France itself, and there remain live questions in France, the Western Sudan, and across the Sahel. Let me say finally that this discussion of recognition in this paper and the theme of recognition is important partly because it seems to be a necessary element in thinking about the later emergence of particular forms of humanitarian and human rights politics vis-a-vis the Sahelian states. And so I've woven it into this earlier part of my project in order to exploit it later on. So what I've tried to do is say there's this long and ancient but dynamic pilgrimage route that changes over time, that in fact long-term historical trends within African history continue to have their own impact, even under British colonial rule in the Sudan. That, in fact, looking precisely at the period of decolonization allows us to see both the kind of vast political experiments that were taking place and also to see the kind of forms of anti-colonialism that were playing out on the ground. I think there's a value, or I hope there's a value, in taking a very oblique angle on this. I mean, nobody looks between Khartoum and Paris because there's no evident link between Khartoum and Paris. But the idea is to be able to think about why it is that a particular vision of empire of the French community of 58 to 60 and a particular vision of Sudanese nationality would come into conflict at that moment, and how it is that the other Sahelian states, Mali in particular, the place that I know best, was asserting its own anti-colonial and emancipatory vision of political membership in a very complex period. So I hope I haven't kind of overburdened you with small facts, narrow time frames, and lots of different place names. And I hope that I can clarify and further discuss some questions. Thank you.
Anybody has any questions? Randy?
Well, first, I'm going to try to summarize what I think I heard to make sure I got it right.
That would help me too.
And then ask you to elaborate on your repeated use of the term hijra, which seemed to me just extraordinarily provocative. I mean, maybe you meant to say less than I read into it. Okay, I gather you're saying that these various political entities, the Sudan, the French Empire, and Mali, were both debating over the status of these mobile populations through papers and the use of those papers in crossing borders. Are these people Sudanese citizens? Are they worthy of rights within Sudan? Are they people protected by French Empire? Or are they Malian citizens? And part of that debate is, are these people being enslaved? Are they moving voluntarily? Are they exploiting resources that legitimately belong only to Sudanese people and not to foreigners? And it's all around the trope of their papers. Am I right? Am I with you so far? Is that right? And you're contesting the notion of Abu Said that foreigners only matter, or that the immigrant or the migrant only matters insofar as the state treats them instrumentally as opposed to people with whom it identifies. And you're adding, actually, the migrants very much matter in the symbolic constitution of units of sovereignty. And so my first question is sovereignty a sufficient term for what you're talking about? Because when we're talking about protecting people who are obviously extraterritorial, we're already getting into the sort of transnational territory. And as sovereignty, what you want to name this phenomenon of claiming people who are far away as worthy of protection by a home unit. And secondly, with the term hijra, I gather you're repeatedly referring to a phenomenon where a group of people moves away from what it considers a legitimate form of sovereignty within its homeland. and turns them, alienates itself from a sovereign territory. So they're trying to escape sovereignty. Is that what you meant by referring to the hijra over and over again?
No.
Oh, okay.
So perhaps that was.
Yeah.
Let me start with the term hijra, which I think I use in two different contexts, but I hope with some precision. The hijra being the withdrawal of the prophet and his companions from a situation which they couldn't practice Islam as they saw fit, right? Correct.
And removing themselves from the authority of people who refuse to let them practice Islam.
Right. So the first hijra to which I referred, and it's the term that was used at the time, was the hijra of some of the leadership of the Sokoto Caliphate and their followers from the northern Nigeria at the time of the British conquest to other lands that remained under Muslim rule, Darfur. So they left Sokoto when Sokoto was going to fall under British rule, Christian rule, to go somewhere else. The second hijra was, and there's a more common kind of usage in Arabic, but the second hijra I think also has this sort of particular time to it, this notion of special time and non-secular time. The second hijra was that of a very small number of Saharan Tuareg dissidents from the rule of people from the south, whom they considered blacks, and this is what Bruce worked on, to other lands where they could live in what they could still consider to be the language in there as well. But both of those usages of the term are indigenous to the discussions. They were using the term themselves to talk about hijra as a kind of withdrawal.
Right.
And I think it's important because they're suggesting that they're not framing their actions in the secular time frame, essentially. And particularly in the first instance, there's a kind of millennial time, which is also under consideration. I should just clarify that both the number of dissidents who the hijra from Mali and the number of people who apparently face trafficking and enslavement in Saudi Arabia are very small. So we're talking, probably in the dozens or scores. So there are many, many other people who are migrants and pilgrims, thousands and thousands. They're not affected by this in the most direct ways. The second question was whether or not the term sovereignty is the best to utilize this act of claiming that new states are attempting to undertake.
And the French too.
And the French.
Claiming to, the need to protect people who are far away from themselves.
Right. I think that at this particular moment, late 50s, early 60s, what the French Empire is very unclear. As I say, there are only three core components to it: defense, currency, and diplomatic representation. And so that notion of protection speaks to diplomatic representation. The Malians are anxious, both for the Malian government is anxious, both that Malians who go to France and that Malians who go to the east are considered Malians and not French nationals. And France is trying to claim even Malians in France as French, right? So there's a battle going on, and it is kind of a symbolic battle, although the numbers are important in terms of migration to France. It's a symbolic battle over claiming particular people as members of one's community, whether they like it or not, essentially. So is sovereignty the best way to think about that? It's possible that it's not the best way to think about that, but I do want a way to think about the kind of aggressive anti-colonialism that characterized the Malian state at the time. Because part of the implicit argument is that French Africa is not neo-colonial Africa from the get-go, and that it's not only Guinea, for example, that has an anti-colonial tradition that needs to be discussed. So that's probably also my pushing this term.
And the hijra seems to represent a form of anti-sovereignty. There, the concept of sovereignty, I think, fits well. In other words, no, you're not sovereign over us. That's about sovereignty.
But I thought your idea of sovereignty was also coupled with the notion of governmentality. In fact, I thought I heard you say at the start of your talk that you were going to also speak about governmentality and non-governmentalities. Did I hear that correctly? Or was I...
The theme of non-governmentality is important to the book project of which this is a part, but it doesn't appear as a theme in this particular paper. So I guess the term come up, I don't think I mentioned it, might have come up in Bruce's introduction. What I'm thinking about is kind of crudely in a way, actually, a lot of the thought behind this thing is very crude, is to think about making a contrast and kind of staging a conflict between particular forms of historicity at work across Sahelian Africa and particular forms of colonial and post-colonial governmentality or governmental rationality aimed at kind of claiming control over people from birth to death via particular bureaucratic forms. In this case, the kinds of papers that allow one to cross borders to accomplish religious obligations. In fact, or also very simple economic tasks.
So the paper thing is the pivotal form of governmentality that you're addressing.
Yes. I'm trying to use travel documents in the same way that I'm using sort of specific Islamic history in this kind of isotopic fashion to think about migration broadly. I'm trying to use travel papers as kind of representative of something larger, a form of governmental rationality being imposed on this very organic situation.
So I'd be interested in knowing the broader context, the idea of the reshaping of territory, reshaping of people. I'd like to hear more.
But also the reshaping of administration, because when you talk about travel documentation, you specifically refer to an administrative unit, and I was looking for that specific administrative unit, because you have to have some kind of registration before you can issue any documentation whatsoever. So that was also something that I was looking for. But we're talking. Sorry,
Go ahead.
Michael.
What's the relative size of the Nigerian Hausa population as different from the Nigerian Hausa population in Darfur at that time, compared to Malian population? If I know about this, what's the interest of France wanting to acquire non-French at between 56 and 60? The Nigerian were British subjects and automatically British citizens, because at that time Nigerians were holding British passport. What's the interest of France in trying to acquire those guys that are not French subjects? And here I see that you quoted French. What's the self-interest of France in trying to do that?
Do you mean, why is it interesting that France tries to do that? Which
Yes.
is a legitimate question. Or what is the self-interest of France
Yes.
in attempting to do
Yes.
that? It's true that if you look at the population of Westerners in Sudan at this time, it's majority Nigerian. And so the estimates are very, very loose. Maybe 10 to 15% are actually from Francophone territories that France claims. Right? Why does France want to claim them now when it has never wanted to claim them before? In fact, it was just as happy it had nothing really to do with them. I think it's precisely because the way that France is now attempting, now being in this
At that time.
under the Fifth Republic, 50, 60 especially, the way that France is attempting to actually anchor and secure this French community is, and its so-called African vocation, is precisely to claim as many people as it can claim, and say, we are here, and that political identity prevails over other potential political identities. It is an act of colonization, essentially. And one of the odd things about this scenario is that, technically, Great Britain colonized Western Sudan. In practice, Nigerians colonized Western Sudan. If one counts in the other term of colonization, to come and establish oneself and to begin to cultivate land as previously uncultivated. That was all West African colonization. It was obviously wasn't British colonization. So it's an attempt at extending a particular form of sovereignty, which is very much in evolution at the time. In other words, we now know the French community basically falls apart, certainly after 1962 and Algerian independence. But nobody knew that in 1959, and nobody knew that actually through 1960. And in terms, for example, it might be best illustrated by looking at the West Africans who go to France. Through 63, they continue to be considered French. And in fact, it's the Malian government and later the Senegalese and the Mauritanians, but especially the Malian government who insist none of those people are French, they're all Malians. And there's a very sharp struggle over applying one's own political identity or affiliation to people who are on the move.
Answer?
Thanks for your talk. I enjoyed it very much. I think one reason I enjoyed it was that the continent started to look like a mass of water to me. Speaking. And in that regard, the term Sahel, which you use, that strip, the East east-west strip. The term Sahel in Arabic means, of course, beach, like the Sawahil on the eastern coast. So that starts to make sense to me that you're doing a sort of oceanic or maybe beach histories. Beach history along the Sahel. Quite fun. And in that regard,
And you know, they used to call camels the ships of the desert. That's another part of the metaphor. Yeah, because that's what the Sahara is like.
water.
That's a very bad joke. But so the Sahel as this beach history makes me think then of on the oceanic side where you have these pilgrimage routes also. The pilgrimage routes are braided with trade routes. They're braided with routes of Islamic student-teacher networks. And also in the oceanic realm, it is clear that the Europeans come in as latecomers to these established routes and networks. And so that is, to me, a clear story. What I wasn't so clear about in your story was the thickness of that pre-existing European braid. I think you had the analysis of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage was a threat across to Mecca. But your story is seen through the lens of the passports and the regimes which interrupt this braid. But I wonder if you could thicken for me a bit this braid in terms of when you have pilgrimage, you always often have trade, and you also have networks of scholars and so on. So I wonder if you could thicken for me this braid, because the thickness of that braid would then, I think, have something to do with the way the response to colonialism, independence, and so on.
Okay. The braid in question being the European braid. You say thickness of the pre-existing braid, the trade of the
right. For example, in studies of Sufi lineages, ethnic diaspora, peanut trade, they all go together in some of these African cases. So we have some examples of thickness of the braid. I wonder if you could sketch up for me that sort of thing on this axis, because it might have bearing on the response to colonialism and then how to think of post-colonial borders.
Okay, I guess the thing that I thought that I heard you say